Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Resignation, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the first part of his work, Ressentiment, Max Scheler is going to discuss situations that are prone to producing ressentiment in people. Now, ressentiment is both an individual and a group and even cultural phenomenon, so it shouldn't be surprising that what he calls social structure can play a role. He does talk about, several different things playing into each other. He calls them hereditary factors and then social structure. But he notes that there are some kinds of ressentiment grounded in what he calls typically recurrent situations. And he puts situations in quotes there, whose emergence is largely independent of individual temperament. So there's certain social situations, and these could be very, very far-reaching, in which we're likely to see some people becoming filled with and motivated by ressentiment because of that situation. So he says it would be foolish to assert every individual in these situations is necessarily gripped by ressentiment, but I do say by virtue of their formal character themselves. Now, what does that mean? The way in which these relations are structured, quite apart from the character of the individuals concerned, these situations, he says, are charged with the danger of ressentiment. And I want to jump ahead to talk about a certain type that Scheler, takes a position on that he thinks will be a bit surprising. So when it comes to criminals, he says, there's usually no ressentiment just where a superficial view would look for it first, in the criminal. Why? Because the criminal, at least certain kinds of criminal, is essentially an active type. Instead of repressing hatred, revenge, envy, and greed, he releases them in crime. So a lot of criminals aren't actually motivated by ressentiment. They're not motivated by good things either. Greed is not a good thing. Envy is not a good thing. Hatred and revenge are not good either. But at least they can be addressed, although, in a way that's criminal, going against other people's rights or, transgressing other values. There are some criminals, though, Scheler says, that are prone to ressentiment. Who? So he says, ressentiment is a basic impulse only in the crimes of spite. Now, what is spite? Spite is when you're doing something to hurt somebody else, to hinder somebody else, to set them back, to humiliate them, and you're not doing it to get anything out of it yourself. You're just doing it for the sake of screwing something up for them. So it's very close to malice as well. But the malicious person actually enjoys doing something to hurt the other person. So he says, these are crimes of spite, which require only a minimum of action and risk, and from which the criminal draws no advantage because they're inspired by nothing but the desire to do harm. And who's a prime example of this? The arsonist, the purest type in point, provided they're not motivated by the pathical urge of watching a fire or by the wish to collect insurance. If they want to collect insurance, well, that's greed, right? But if they're setting fires just to hurt other people, well, then that could certainly be ressentiment. He goes on and he says, criminals of this type strangely resemble each other. Usually they're quiet, taciturn, shy, quite settled and hostile to alcoholic or other excesses. Their criminal act is usually a sudden outburst of impulses of revenge or envy which have been repressed for years. And he says a typical cause would be the continual deflation of one's ego by the constant sight of the neighbor's rich and beautiful farm. And then he talks about class ressentiment as well, and he brings up a crime in which somebody stretched a wire between two trees, and what was the point of that? Decapitating passing automobilists, people who are driving their cars with the top off. And he says, well, this is a typical case of ressentiment. Any car driver or passenger could be the victim, and there's no interested motive. The other kind of criminality that he thinks is connected with ressentiment, slander and defamation of character. He says ressentiment often plays a major role. So that's one situation that is, perhaps charged with ressentiment. Then at the very beginning, he talks about women in relation to men. Why? She is the weaker, and not just physically weaker, but in society placed in a disadvantaged position quite often. And therefore, he says, the more vindictive sex. Now, Scheler is not the only person to say this, and he'll actually bring up some examples. The Eumenides in Greek mythology, very scary things. That Eumenides means the peaceful ones. They're actually the Furies, right? Aeschylus's play brings a clear and plastic picture of a power which heals from ressentiment. Notice what he's going to say. So these are a new masculine civilization, but who are the gods? Apollo and Athena. So Apollo, a certain kind of masculinity. Athena, a certain kind of masculinity and femininity, right? Gossiping is a form of self-cure, and he says that the danger of feminine ressentiment is intensified. Why? Because of social structures. Nature and custom impose upon woman a reactive and passive role in love. So matters of love and sex are often fraught with ressentiment. Feelings of revenge born from rejection in the erotic sphere, he says, are always subject to repression. Why? Communication and recriminations are barred from pride and modesty, right? So taking value in one's own pride, one's self-esteem, and also wanting to be modest prevents the woman from actually saying what she wants to say to the person who treats her badly. And he says there's no tribunal which repairs these injuries, provided they violate no civil rights. Women are forced to great reserve by stronger barriers of convention and modesty. And he's going to bring up the character of the old maid, the woman who is unable to succeed in, we could call it the marketplace of love and sexuality. And he says that she's got repressed cravings for tenderness, sex, and propagation, so she's rarely free of ressentiment. And then he talks about prudery. So when somebody is prudish, they're not really being modest. They've got something else going on. He says that prudery is one of the numerous variants of sexual ressentiment. What does it look like? Obsessively ferreting out sexually significant events and surroundings to condemn them. This is nothing, he says, but sexual gratification transformed into ressentiment satisfaction. And he here also targets the Anglo-American morality as being particularly given to prudishness, which I think a case certainly could be made for at the time that he is writing, right? And he says that ressentiment imitates modesty by means of prudery, but it also depreciates true modesty. Genuine feminine modesty, which conceals what it secretly knows to be beautiful and valuable, is interpreted, this is the ressentiment, as mere fear of revealing physical defects or faults in dress and makeup. And so, this is one main thing. Now, Scheler is not saying that this is just the way it has to be or anything like that. He thinks this is actually a problem, that it makes women in contemporary society more prone to ressentiment, perhaps, than men, but there's no guarantee, of course, right? And then he talks about another very interesting feature, the older generation in relation to the younger generation. He says that if you want the process of aging to be a, as he calls it, fruitful and satisfactory one, the important transitions have to be accompanied by free resignation, the renunciation of the values proper to the preceding stage of life. So, if you want to, so to speak, have it all, and in your old age or in your middle age, your maturity, have everything that you had as a teenager, as a 20-something, even as a child, you're really setting yourself up for ressentiment, because the younger generation is going to come along and they actually do deserve those sorts of things. He goes on and he says, spiritual and intellectual values, which remain untouched by the process of aging, together with the values of the next stage of life, must compensate for what has been lost. Only if this happens can we cheerfully relive the values of our past in memory without envy for the young to whom they're still accessible. So, for example, being able to enjoy yourself and stay up late at night and drink as much as you want and, engage in physical activities that now you're not capable of. For example, I could be very upset about the fact that I can't run because I'm missing two tendons in my, or ligaments rather, in my left knee, which were damaged, but I'm out of shape anyway, so I'm not going to run like some young guy and play soccer and do all those sorts of things. And I could be resentful of that. I could be envious of those young people who get to do that. And then I could detract them and say, in my time, we did things so much better, not like these kids these days with their laziness. You see where this is going, right? And every single generation of people aging has been doing this as far back as we can find magazines and newspapers and broadsheets. They're all complaining about the previous generation because of ressentiment, which is a failure on their part. And, Scheler points out that it wasn't always this way. In earlier stages of civilization, old age is so highly honored and respected for its experience that ressentiment doesn't really have much chance to develop. But education spreads through printing and other modern media and increasingly replaces the advantage of experience. And we can think of our own time and the fact that you can just, in your hand, hold a phone or tablet that gives you all sorts of information way beyond what people had available to them in Scheler's time. So that's one issue. Younger people displace the old from their positions and professions and push them into the defensive. As the pace of progress increases in all fields and as the changes of fashion tend to affect even the higher domains, the old can no longer keep up with their juniors. Novelty becomes a increasingly important value, right? So, there's a lot of older people that can become filled with ressentiment as they are being displaced in their view because they don't really have something within themselves that they can value. If you do, in fact, cede the floor to the younger and say, I don't have to try to do everything that they do. I don't have to compete with them. I've got my stuff over here that I am quite happy with, even if it's not, I'm the best or anything like that. Well, then you can have that, what he called resignation. You can be quite happy and not resentful. Another example, or rather a dynamic that he brings up, typical interfamily and intermarital relationships. And he brings up the mother-in-law and says, she's actually a tragic figure. If you think about why things kind of suck for her, the child she loved since its birth and who loved her in return, the son for whom she's done everything, now turns to another woman who's done nothing for him and yet feels entitled to demand everything. And the mother is supposed to accept this event, welcome it, offer her congratulations, and receive the intruder with affection. Now, is that the right way to look at it? No, but that is the way that a lot of mother-in-laws do look at it, especially if they've coddled their children and they didn't produce an actual man, but just a boy who's still tied to the proverbial apron strings. But we could talk about younger children in relation to the older child, older wives with a younger husband. There's all sorts of interesting possibilities for this. And again, he's not saying that every situation like this will make somebody resentful, feeling ressentiment. He's just saying these are situations where it's by the very structure of the situation, prone to produce that. He then, after talking about criminals, talks about soldiers. He tells us that among the types of human activity which have always played a role in history, the soldier is least subject to ressentiment. Now, is that really true? I think as a generalization, and actually having been in the Army myself and kept up on military stuff, I'm not sure I actually buy that entirely. It probably depends on other factors. But, at least the soldier gets to be quite open in what they're going to do. But they could be subject to envy or desire for revenge. But he talks about the priest. And here he says Nietzsche actually has this right in pointing out that the priest is most exposed to this danger of ressentiment. Why? It's not that all priests are going to be filled with ressentiment, but the requirements of his profession expose the priest more than any human type to the creeping poison of ressentiment. And we could think of other occupations that are similar to this in our own time. It doesn't have to be a religious figure. So he says, in principle, he's not supported by any secular power. As the representative of a concrete institution, he is to be sharply distinguished from the homo religiosus, the religious person. He is placed in the middle of party struggle. He's condemned to control his emotions, revenge, wrath, hatred, at least outwardly. He must always represent the image and principle of peacefulness. The typical priestly policy of gaining victories through suffering rather than combat, or through the counterforces which the sight of the priest's suffering produces in men who believe he unites them with God, is inspired, Scheler says, by ressentiment. But he's going to say, not all priests are like that. There is no trace of ressentiment, he's going to declare, in genuine martyrdom. Now, martyrdom means witnessing. It doesn't just mean bad things happen to you for the sake of your religion. It means that you're willing to take on suffering and perhaps even death because you want to testify to the truth of something. So, this is an important set of considerations. And then the last one that he brings up, which I think is very, very interesting. What about the industrial proletariat? Now, there were plenty of people in Scheler's time, and there's plenty of people in our own time who are like, people who belong to unions, workers, they're filled with envy, ressentiment. They wish they were rich, and that's why they want to tear everything down. And Scheler says, no, that's not the case at all. You're not going to find a lot of ressentiment in the actual industrial proletariat, people who genuinely work for a living in the kinds of professions that are often not particularly valued. So in our time, we might say not just factory workers, but cleaners. People working in retail are probably not as prone to ressentiment as who? As other classes, which he talks about as being the artisans, people who do certain tasks that are more specialized, the petty bourgeoisie, that's the small bourgeoisie, the small business owners. Scheler thinks they're going to be more prone to ressentiment. And small officials, people who are in charge of stuff, but they're not really in charge of a lot. They will tend to throw their weight around. Managers, coordinators, those sorts of types, bureaucrats. And so there's a lot of different possible situations that are not automatically by themselves producing ressentiment, but they make people more prone to it. And you notice that, why is this the case? Because it tends to exacerbate the sources and the factors that feed into the dynamic of ressentiment, particularly impotence in relation to other people.